Okay guys, I'm a little new with this Facebook Live thing, so bear with me as we get this all set up. Oh. We're going to continue, just figuring out little technical difficulties. Welcome everyone who's watching. I am AJ Temple, owner, head distiller, floor sweeper, bottler of Temple Distilling up in Linwood. We're here to talk about gin, one of my favorite things to talk about, and definitely a passion of mine. A little background on me and us and the distillery, which, going back into how I got into this, I've been destroying the kitchen since I was about 5, so I've always loved everything culinary, and to me what really drew me into gin was it really is kind of the chef's spirit. You've got all this control over very specific ingredients, a lot of things going on. If you look at something like whiskey, it's more like baking bread. You're limited to a certain number of ingredients. It's up to the oven or the barrel to really do a lot of the finishing job. I wanted a lot of control and a lot of kind of alchemy and play over things. So that's just kind of the short of it, but as we start talking more about it, you'll kind of understand where our passions lie and where our direction lies. So what am I drinking right now? Because I hope you guys are all enjoying something too. Got one of my favorite gin and tonics. Globe style glasses like this are probably one of my favorite ways to enjoy a G&T. It is, the shape of it will kind of direct some of the aromatics that you've got garnishes in today. If you can see, I've got a nice sprig of rosemary from our garden. I'll oftentimes use, juniper berries or something like that in there, certain kinds of fruit if you're feeling different, but definitely something fresh that really adds to this. I am having some of our Navy Strength gin in it, which is a higher proof, more citrus forward version of the few different gins that we make. And if you can see, it kind of gets a little bit of this effect called lushing, which we can talk about with gin. It clouds it a little bit because there's a lot of different citrus oils in there, mainly some lime and some grapefruit, and just pairs with the tonic really nicely. Looking at some of the comments coming in, yes, French 75s, that's one of my favorites, one of my wife's favorites too. So cheers to everybody. So as we get into gin, what is it? Really, if you want to be really kind of blunt about it, it is flavored vodka. There are some distillers that would roll their eyes back in their head hearing that, but it's true. You have to start with a neutral, clear spirit that's been distilled where there's no residual sugar, there's really no viscosity, it is a blank canvas, and then you add your botanicals to that and infuse the flavor and the oils from the botanicals through the process of distillation. So we should probably talk about distillation a little bit, and I'm going to get super nerdy and bring out a whiteboard, so hold on just a second. Okay, let's see if this works. So, basics of distillation. Some of you may know this, but I just want to cover all the bases because it's going to make a lot more sense as we talk about the actual production process for gin. So all alcohol starts the same way. You are starting with some sort of sugar that yeast is introduced to. The yeast then eats that sugar and the byproduct is alcohol. Process takes only a couple of days, and whether you're starting with grapes or actual sugar cane that's already a sugar content, or you're starting with something like wheat or corn or a starch that you then convert into sugar, either way, at the end of that process you end up with a bunch of liquid that is somewhere between 5 and 15% alcohol by volume. So that is where beer and wine kind of end their journey. They either go into a barrel, they get bottled. So how do you get high proof? Well, it really boils down to boiling. So you've got a still here, you've got your alcohol in it, let's say 5 to 10%, and you have to heat it. So alcohol molecules, ethanol, methanol, all those different isotopes, they boil at a lower temperature than water does. Water, of course, boils at 212. Ethanol boils, I can't remember the exact number, but it's 170 something. It is about 30 to 40 degrees lower than water. So when you heat up that mixture, the water is going to stay in the bottom of the still. The alcohol is going to turn into a gas. And that's why when you see a still, there's a big base where it's all kept. It goes up the still column, the gas does, that's almost pure alcohol, it travels over to this unit called the condenser, and that is where we are pumping cold water through to cool that gas back into a liquid. So that is how you go from something that's 5 to 15% all the way up to, when we get gin off the still, it's around 160 proof. It's super strong, and that's kind of the process of doing that. So that's distillation in a nutshell. There are definitely a lot more specifics with the different types of stills, how you apply heat and all that fun stuff. But so we've got a vodka. That's what we're starting with. How do you get the botanical flavor into that? Well, there's two methods. One of them is when you are macerating, which is the way we do it, where you soak all of the botanicals like in a big bag of tea, basically. You're soaking it overnight where the gin is cold. The alcohol is able to absorb a lot of those oils, and then we redistill it, and it brings the oils that we want across, infusing it during that process with heat, and then cooling it down and proofing it to our final product. And the other way to do that, and it's popular if you are doing a bunch of other different spirits on the same still, is a gin basket. So instead of having all your botanicals in the bottom of the still, you've got an apparatus towards the end before the condenser that all that hot, delicious alcoholic gas is traveling through and infusing as it goes. This keeps any of those oils from falling back into the still and flavoring the copper, which in turn then you make a whiskey and you might taste a little bit of gin in there. So it's two methods of the same thing. The vapor infusion tends to lend more of an aromatic quality. You get a lot of nose on it. It doesn't always have the same staying power or palate feel on the mouth. So since we're just doing gin, I don't care if the still is flavored with our gin oils. That's all we're using her for. Here is a picture, actually, show and tell, since we aren't at the distillery right now. So this is Marie. This is our still. This is an article I did for Distiller Magazine a couple years back about our heating style and how we do it. But the base of the kettle is actually a Bain Marie, so it's a double boiler. We have it filled with waste vegetable oil that gets heated up with electric heating elements, and it takes a long time, but it is a really, really soft heat, so I'm able to put fresh citrus peel in there, whereas usually you're forced to use all dried stuff and you worry about hot spots and burning some of the more volatile organic compounds like that. So we're able to wait a little while longer, but we're able to get a lot of that flavor infusion in there. So botanicals, I've got some here to show you, since we'll do some show and tell. Actually, this is probably easier this way. So, Juniper, the king of gin. This is what it looks like. You can see that in my hand. So they're called juniper berries, which is accurate because of the shape of them. They look like berries. Kristen's asking if we have a secret ingredient. Well, juniper isn't that secret, but we've got a few tricks up our sleeve. One of them, I think one of the more distinctive ones that we use, is Angelica Root. We certainly aren't the only gin maker to use that, but I use a bit more than most recipes that you'll find out there, because I find that the grassy earthiness and a little bit of the body that it lends to gin is one of our favorite aspects, especially in a London dry gin. But back on juniper, so it's not really a berry in the sense of a fruit. They're in the conifer family, and that's why you get all those lovely piney flavors in a very juniper forward gin. And if you tear it apart, you can kind of see, let's see if that shows up. The inside, it's got all these kind of sticky pine coney like things in there. What do those smell like? They smell like heaven. But no, they smell like an evergreen tree a little bit. And you've got a lot of kind of spice and brightness in there. And so by law, to call something a gin, it has to be a distilled spirit above 40% alcohol by content that is primarily flavored with juniper. So the interesting thing with that is their use of primary. They can't really control and quantify our process based on flavor. That could be so subjective depending on who's tasting it. So when we submit recipes into the federal government and they have to tell us that we're approved to call this a gin and we can go ahead and make it, I have to provide them with a recipe of sorts. We kind of give them a range of what we use, and juniper is almost always going to be the largest recipe or largest ingredient by weight. It is not very strong on its own. I can tell you that a batch of our London Dry, we are using about 10 pounds of juniper, which is 3 or 4 kind of large tea bags that we fill with that. On the lemon peel side of things, which we have a decent amount of lemon in a couple of our gins, we are using 100 grams. So just a small handful, and you're getting both flavors across. So it becomes kind of an interesting range that, yes, every single gin on the market by law should be primarily flavored with juniper. They should all taste like a pine tree. That's not always the case, because we could do 90% less juniper, we'd be legally following the requirements, and you would barely taste it at all. Jackson's asking if we use any citrus. So I do. I love citrus with gin, especially. We'll talk about that when we get into cocktails. But the London Dry, I use 3 different kinds of orange peel. We use a fresh navel, a sweet orange dried, and a bitter orange dried. And then we also use lemon peel in that. The Navy Strength, we switched over to using fresh lime peel and dried grapefruit peel to give it a bit brighter, bolder of a backbone. And then, yeah, we've used a few other things in some of the, like the co-authored series, which we'll talk about in a bit. So, botanicals are really important. You're going to use juniper first and foremost, and then have all these supporting ingredients. I don't have my flavor wheel with me. I've got a big poster in our tasting room, but you can kind of see all the different corners. There's some great resources out online. I know Gin Foundry in the UK, and the gin is in Aaron Knoll out of Colorado. They've kind of got this compendium of different flavor wheels for different gins. It's fun to look at and pair and find out what you like, what you may not like, so you know what gins to avoid, things like that. So yeah, we use juniper. You've got citrus, you've got some earth and spice in the middle. We use some cubeb berry, which is, they look like peppercorns with little tails on them. Let's see if you can see them here. So those are lovely because they have kind of a lavendery bright pepper note, which is, it's lovely in the London Dry. But when we went to Navy Strength, which is 114 proof, that's the strength at which cannon powder will still ignite if you spill it on there, hence the name, you're reminded very much so that those things are in the pepper family. Very spicy. So we took those out. We made a few adjustments with the recipe there, added some cassia cinnamon bark and some other cool stuff. So the last thing to touch on with gin process would probably be London Dry versus New Western, New American, Contemporary. There's a bunch of different names for it. What that really boils down to, because people are like, what does dry mean? What does London mean? It is a flavor and a quality process designation. So on the London Dry, we have to use, well, I'll correct myself there. If you were in the UK and making a London Dry, you were required by law to use a super purified neutral grain spirit base, basically a totally blank canvas, so that all of the flavors you are tasting are the botanicals, not really any of the original, whether it's wheat or grape, whatever you use to do the fermentation. You don't have any of that really grain character coming through. That's where the dry comes from, because when you have a lower distilled, like a vodka that still has some flavor, if you tasted that from different distilleries, you get some of that grain character, you get some sweetness and some thickness. That's not what is considered dry when talking about gin. So that's kind of where that comes from. Anything that is falling into the line of you're starting with a vodka that has some character, some flavor to it, and then adding your botanicals to make your gin, that is the New Western, New American, Contemporary style. And they both have their ups and their downs depending on mostly what your flavor loves are, cocktails that you like, and things like that. So for our recipe development process, oh, Kathleen's asking, will the label always identify the botanicals used? No, in fact, I find that maybe 20% of gins, if I were to go through my gin shelf, at least from the last like 5 years that I've seen have botanicals listed. We originally just had them on our website and figure if someone was really interested, they could go find it. We revised our labels to add them onto the back because I think it is really important to know what's in there. But some people are a little bit trying to keep that recipe secret, and this is a good segue into my next section on recipe development. Even if you were to give someone your exact recipe or maybe a really tight range of what botanicals you use and the process you use to make it, the chances of you making that exact same gin are very small. There's just so many variables that go into the distillation process, and how you're applying heat, what size your still is, if you've got you know, a 4-foot column versus a 6-foot column. There's this process called reflux where that hot alcohol gas travels up. Well, it's traveling up to a part that is cooler in the still, so that's going to cool some of it and cause it to fall back down, and it kind of cleans up the flavor, but you also can lose some botanical oils and flavor. So there's just all these little tweaks that we got our recipe down, and that's why I love using our still and using an electric method, because we can duplicate it the same every single time. The huge manufacturers are doing that too, just on a much larger scale, but it's just you know, it's one of those things that it comes down to each person's gin and how they like to do it. And with our recipe stuff, we started by, Kristen's asking people how to buy our gin. Well, we're there Saturdays at the tasting room in Linwood from 12 to 4. We also have an online store and can ship to most states and throughout Washington for sure. It's chapter1gin.com, or you can navigate there through templedistilling.com too. So recipes, we decided on like 30 botanicals that we thought we'd be interested in possibly using, and I've got a little tabletop 1-liter lab still that we sat down and distilled each one of those botanicals, keeping every variable we could the same. You put a liter of a 50-50 blend of grain alcohol and water in, you put 20 grams of juniper, 20 grams of lemon, you know, repeated that process each time under the same temperature conditions, and you ended up with this wonderful table full of mason jars with botanical, just pure botanical distillates in there. And you know that every aspect of that process was kept the same. So now what you're doing is comparing, okay, how did this flavor come across? How strong is that flavor, knowing that you use the same amount by weight versus another ingredient. And then you start to blend, you add water, you figure out what flavor profiles you might be interested in. And once you're starting to do blends, you start doing small batches, you slowly work up from that point. And with our London Dry, this probably took us 5 or 6 months to really get it right. It's our flagship gin. It's one of our most awarded, and why we got into this. So we were very picky about that, and we knew that we wanted to do a Navy strength, which is what I'm having in my G&T right now. And we knew that when you dialed up the proof, that citrus oils really work nicely in that. We knew that the cubeb berry and grains of paradise would come off as too peppery and hot at the higher proof. So I sat down, penned out a recipe based on our London Dry, making some tweaks, and said, let's just give this a go. And that's the way we've been making it ever since. So that gin took us a day to make. The other one took 6 months. You just don't know. You just have to experiment and try. And that's really why I got into this, you know, on that side of things. So let's go make a cocktail. I think, yeah, we've got plenty of time. Because when it comes to gin, we know that cocktails are king. There's not many people, I'm one of them, but there's not many people who just drink gin straight. If we want to talk about tasting, there's really no right or wrong way to do it. You just have to sip slow enough so you don't overwhelm your nose with vapors from it. But since there's no residual sugar content in gin, it's not as palatable as if you're having whiskey or a rum or a liqueur, especially something like that. So here, let's go make a Negroni. That is one of my favorite cocktails to make. You get to come through our messy house here, so let's see. Aaron is asking favorite gin cocktails. I don't know if I have enough time to go over all of them. But no, we're starting with a Negroni because that is definitely my favorite. We've got Aviation's Last Words are up there. Definitely, you know, lovely dry martinis, things like that. So Somebody holler if you can't hear me, but I'm gonna get this set up on our bar so that you can see pretty well. So Negronis, I like to stir. You can shake, there's nothing wrong with that, but I like how clear they are, and there's enough lower alcohol content in that. So Kathleen's asking out, why are they called that? There was a guy named Count Negroni, I think back in the early 1900s, and the cocktail ended up being named after him because of how he was ordering what was originally an Americano with Negroni, or with Campari, and then adding gin to it. So I personally love using our woodcut in a Negroni because it bridges the gap between the sister drink to that, which is a Boulevardier. Normally you use bourbon or a whiskey of some sort to make it. So this is our Navy strength gin, but we age it in bourbon barrels for 9 months. So it's got a little bit of sweetness and some of the barrel character, but it's still a nice gin for doing cocktails like this with. So you're gonna do 1 part of gin. I usually do a slightly heavier pour on the gin side of things. 1 part of Campari, this lovely bitter Italian aperitif that I just adore. And then you're gonna do 1 part of sweet vermouth, which my little trick, I take that 1 part and I do about 2/3 of the always dependable but less expensive Martini and Rossi, and then a splash of some Carpano Antica. It gives it a little extra nice bitter kick. So now you stir. I personally will say that probably 50 stirs is where you want to end up. I'll come over here and talk to you in person. Yeah, it's when you're deciding between stirring and shaking, you are achieving the same thing by cooling the cocktail down. You want it cold and refreshing. The difference there is how watered down. Yes, Kristen, it's true. 50 to 65. That's how specific I'm going to be with the number of stirs. When you practice enough, you get used to it without thinking much of it. But it really comes down to how watered down you want it to be. When you shake, it's going to water it down really fast. So the stronger cocktails are usually nice with a shake. It also gets it a little bit colder. But for me, I like my cocktails on the stronger side, and I want to taste that bitter really coming through from the Campari, so I opt to stir. It makes a better looking drink too. Since you don't get little ice chips, it doesn't cause it to cloud up. So there we are, 50 to 65 stirs, and I've got to go grab a glass. Only slightly prepared for this. So, best thing about a Negroni, get a big ice cube maker. You don't have to have huge ice chunks, but you know, one of those huge blocks that you use an axe to crack the thing off of. But get a nice big ice cube, because you want to enjoy the Negroni when it's cold. You want to keep it cold, but you don't want it getting any more watered down than it is. So then you use your stopper here. Pour it in the glass. Lovely, lovely. And you want to finish with a nice big orange peel. So you always want to try and express the peel close to the drink so that those citrus oils, as you're peeling it, kind of fall onto the top. And then wipe the rim, and you've got your Negroni. So let's go back outside. Thank you, Kristen. I worked on it. We just moved into this house a few months ago, and I've still got stuff kind of strewn everywhere, but we'll head back out here since it is a nice day, and I want to use the whiteboard one more time. So, yeah, that's really good. So now I have 2 drinks in front of me, no judgment. Let's start with kind of the cocktail basics to know. There is a Barbadian rhyme that's based off of a rum punch, and the saying goes, 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, and 4 of weak. So it has to do with rum punch. The ratios are a bit on the watery side because it is a punch, but I use that kind of basis when I am coming up with any kind of gin cocktail. Let's see if I've got room on here. So we're gonna do a diagram. That's a terrible drawing of a still, but please forgive me. So over here, let's do a pyramid. I feel like I'm in science class now. We're gonna separate it into 4 parts. Now the bottom, this should be your strong. That is gonna be your gin, your spirit, whatever you're using as the base for your cocktail. That should be the largest part of the pyramid. Moving up from that, you're gonna want your sour as the next component. So that could be citrus, it could be bitter, it could be a wine-based, like a dry vermouth or something like that. And then next part, you're gonna want your sweet. That's pretty obvious. It's either a simple syrup or a sweet vermouth or a liqueur. So we've got all of that, and then you want your weak at the very top. That is really just going to be a byproduct of shaking or stirring, i.e. water. So use that ratio when you are doing any kind of cocktail. I'm all about ratios. We do, you know, say a Negroni, for instance, you've got gin, 1.5 parts of that. You then move on to your bitter, so your Campari next. You've got your sweet with the sweet vermouth, and then you stir to get your weak portion of it. And there's some other lovely cocktails that are coming to my mind. One of them is one that we call a page turner. It's 2 parts of our gin, whether London Dry or Navy Strength, 1 part lemon juice, 1/2 part grapefruit liqueur, and then 1/2 part simple syrup that you can infuse with rosemary. That's a nice little extra step. But either way, I'm always thinking of these ratios. 2 of strong, 1 of the citrus or bitter, and then 1/2 part of some sort of sweetening agent, and then you're shaking it up or stirring it and serving it. It's a really great way to think about that. As far as pouring goes, because I definitely, when you watch me make that Negroni, I'm not using a shot glass, I'm not using any kind of measuring tool. That is a great skill to try and get when you're doing cocktails. One of the best ways to get there with free pouring is get yourself a 1 ounce shot glass or some sort of measured amount shot glass, and go and pour some water into it out of a bottle. We just, you know, pour, stop, dump it, do it over the sink, look like a crazy person, but eventually you're gonna get the feel of what pouring an ounce is gonna feel like. And the more you do that, then you can kind of learn how to do that from a bottle, rather than trying to find, if you're over at a friend's house and they're asking you to mix something up, asking them if they've got shot glasses and measuring devices and all this stuff. Keep it simple. Just think about the ratios. You know, any recipe you see, it's going to say 1.25 ounces of this and 0.75 ounces of that. Well, just in your mind go, okay, that's almost a 2-to-1. We're going to go with that. And I really think that's actually one of the best ways to do it. You can also get, which for making more complex cocktails, like the page turner or something, this is called a jigger, and it is always going to be a 2-to-1. So there is a larger side and then a smaller side. So for ratio cocktail making, this is definitely one of my favorite things to use. This one I think is 1.5 ounces on this end and 0.75 on this. But that's another good tool to have in the shed. Does anyone have any other questions about gin and gin process, or about our gins at all? And Jacqueline's asking, is it true a 3 count is approximately 1 ounce? It really depends on the bottle. I've had some bottles that I feel like take forever to pour out. Saint Germain is one of them, just with the top like this and then a small opening. That one takes a little longer. Our bottles on our gins tend to pour a little faster. I didn't do that by design, but that's just how they are. So it really does depend, which is why getting a feel for the stream and then the weight of what you've got coming out of it is ideally the best way, but as a standard, yeah, you can start with a 3 count for an ounce. No matter what, if you're following the idea of ratios, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you're just going to end up with a slightly larger or smaller cocktail, but it's going to be the right cocktail. And Melissa's asking if we can add the page turner recipe. Yes, in fact, we just had somebody order half a case of gin because they've been making them all the time. So if they're watching, thank you, shout out. But yeah, that's one of our favorites. We are in the midst of switching over to a new website, which is going to have a cocktail recipe section, but we'll be sure to post them. Christina's asking how many types of gin we make. Technically right now I think we're at 5. We do what's called a co-authored series, which actually, let me go get the bottles since we're talking about it. Then you can see them in person. So the co-authored series was a bartender cocktail competition that then we collaborated with the bartender who won our competition to do a gin with them, basically. So we've got, sorry, my terrible directing work. Yes, this is the co-authored series. So it is, this current one, we used some cool stuff, some curry leaves, nutmeg, lemongrass, some saffron to finish it, and a post infusion. So it's a really cool one. It's got some spice, it's got a lot of complexity to it. Shout out to Jonathan Stanyard who helped co-author it with us. It really turned out awesome. Chapter 1 London Dry is our flagship. That is our most popular, definitely your go-to for martinis and any kind of classic gin cocktails. The Navy Strength is its bigger, bolder, older brother. That's the 114 proof and heavy on citrus. It's got a lot of brightness, a big backbone to it. So that's a favorite for gin and tonics, last words, all those really strong, complex gin cocktails. And then we've got our woodcut, which is aged in bourbon barrels for 9 months. It starts as the Navy Strength. And we've got our Constant Reader, which, see if I have a bottle around here somewhere. Nope, it's walked off, it's gone. But we have that as our kind of more economic option in a 1 liter bottle. And then we do our Limoncello, which a lot of people love and are always asking about. It is gin based. We use our Navy Strength gin and we soak it, soak fresh lemon peels in it for a month and a half to get a really, really classically tasting limoncello out of it. So that's definitely a favorite too. And anyone have any other questions on gin, on ingredients, on cocktails? I talked a little bit in my promo about modifying cocktails with gin that maybe don't have gin in them already. Cosmo's a great one. Got cranberry juice, lime, triple sec, or Cointreau. That's a super tasty one to mess around with. I definitely have Bloody Marys with gin in them. That's tasty. If you've got, Chris is asking my other favorite local gins. So, other favorite local gins, there are quite a few. In fact, I'm always collecting different gins for my shelf. I definitely enjoyed the Rogue Spruce Barrel Gin. That's out of Oregon. Let's see, Juliana, any other ingredients you say don't use in gin? Not really. I tried to distill some lemon verbena, and it did not taste good. I don't know if it was just the heat from one of the test things, but that is definitely a ingredient that I didn't like. We tried some mace for one of the co-authored gins, which had an interesting flavor, but the oils in there were just nuts. They were crazy. So some of those kind of spicy ends. I don't like to put spice in there because that can be a very subjective thing that some people like and don't. You can always add it in some other ingredient in a cocktail that you're having. And yeah, we'll definitely post how to find our stuff. Besides our web store in the tasting room, Total Wine carries most of our lineup, and we've got a little map on our website where you can find us too. So Botanist, yeah. Botanist would probably fall somewhere in between our London Dry and Navy Strength. They're definitely still a nice dry category of a gin without being too contemporary. A lot of botanical expression. Definitely, I like that. I had to get a gin from your local liquor store. Which brand would you choose? It depends on what I'm making with it, which is always the loaded question. If I'm doing a martini, I tend to reach for like Plymouth, G&T in a hotel room on a hot day. I'll take Tanqueray all day long. With some more funky experimental stuff, if I'm wanting to do a Vesper that's different, that Kenobi gin out of Kyoto is really nice. That's got some shiso and tea in it and some other stuff. It's one of the reasons I love gin is you could spend your whole life traveling the whole world, tasting every gin you possibly can, and you're still not going to find two that are the same. And anyone who says they don't like gin, I'm like, no, just go out, taste them. You just haven't found the right one for you yet. And the other interesting thing, I've had a few people think that they were allergic to gin because of the juniper. Juniper isn't really a high allergen from everything that I've heard from folks. And I had a few people realize after a long time of kind of trial and error and mistakes that what they ended up being allergic to was quinine and tonic water, and had gin and tonic a lot. I love gin and tonics, but they found that out and then realized, oh, I can have gin with other stuff. I don't have any adverse reactions. There was a thought that it was, gin is some crude spirit that's fermented juniper berries and then turned into something, but it really is vodka with the essential oils from your botanical ingredients in them. Let's see, Kristen said, what was the one experienced person producer that made you want to make gin? So the idea of doing this actually started when I was 12, before Judgment Falls. I wasn't drinking gin at 12, but we visited the Plymouth Gin Distillery in the UK, and since I was into the culinary stuff then, even, I just fell in love with the concept of getting to make a gin like that. We were watching Sean, who's still the head distiller there, shoveling juniper berries in the still with an actual shovel out of burlap sacks, and it was just the smells permeating everything, and it kind of stuck in my head. And then got out of college, did studies in marketing and some other stuff, and I was in the auto industry. I had a job at a shop there for almost 10 years and just got really burnt out. It wasn't the line of work for me. They opened up some of the barriers to entry with starting a distillery in the state and nationwide, and suddenly it was, it turned in from, if I won the lottery, what would you want to do? Open a distillery? Well, then it became, I'm getting burnt out. It's time to make a crazy change like this. Why don't we do it? And here we are. It's that's just how we got there. And it happened the year that we were thinking about getting into the business. The ADI conference, American Distilling Institute, which is a great resource. They're actually the ones that published my book last year on gin. They came in with their conference through Seattle, and I signed up to go to these classes, ended up doing a hands-on class with Ben and Holly at Captive Spirits, Big Gin. I love Big Gin. They're now with Hood River down in Oregon, but we kind of had a business plan written, and a lot of it turned out to be how they were running things, and we're like, hey, we can actually do this. So we did that. We did a class with a distillery out in Rochester, New York the next year, kind of got all our stuff together, and now we're... almost 4.5 years in, we're distributed in a few states and have a shop in Belgium that carries our gin too. So just weird, small world kind of stuff. Let's see. Does anyone else have any other gin questions before we sign off? I'm just going to sit here and sip a Negroni for a minute. All right. Well, if not, I think that might do it. We'll do Kristen says Holly and Ben. Yeah, they're awesome. Great gin. There's a lot of great gin in this part of the world. I'm on the board for the Washington Distillers Guild, and we oversee, I think we have 60 or 70 members, but a lot of distilleries in the state. Yes, Limoncello is available at most Total Wines. You want to check their website before you go, just because they carry different sizes. We've got a 375 ml and then a full 750. Some of the stores have some have one. And then Laura's asking, what's our Negroni recipe? So classic recipe, 1 part gin, 1 part Campari, 1 part sweet vermouth. I use about 1.5 parts gin, 1 part Campari, and then 1 part sweet vermouth, but I do a blend of a kind of more standard Martini and Rossi type vermouth, one of the $10 bottles, and then part of the Carpano Antica, which is a little bit more bitter and complex. So that tends to be my favorite. Yeah, and the Carpano you can get at Costco too, which is a sweet deal. And Fred says, yes, inspired a gin martini. It's always a good idea. Always a good idea. Little tip on a gin martini, if you want to switch it up a little bit, because you can be very, very hardcore with how you like your martinis. I'm definitely a very dry martini kind of person. A little splash, if any, of vermouth, and it needs to be something good like a Dolan. And then if you have orange bitters, just a single little drop of orange bitters before you shake it or stir it is a really nice change up with that. So let's see, and we've got ruby red grapefruit in the fridge. Creative idea to use that with gin. Always. So grapefruit and gin, you've either got a salty dog or I'm blanking on the name of the other one, but it's gin and grapefruit. Usually I would say, depending on if the ruby red is on the sweeter side, have something bitter in there too. I would even venture to say, like, go with some fresh lime juice, add the grapefruit, and then add a little simple syrup, or if you have a liqueur like a Saint Germain, a little splash in there. Jason's asking if we have a great gin gimlet recipe. So a gimlet is really like, to me, it is the gin version of a margarita, which sounds a little crazy, but it's true. So I usually make my margaritas. You've got tequila, you've got lime, you've got triple sec or Cointreau or Grand Marnier, and then simple syrup. So I kind of do the gimlets the same. I'll do 2 parts of gin, 1 part of fresh squeezed lime juice, half part of triple sec or Cointreau, and then a splash of simple syrup, depending on how sweet you like it, and shake that up. That's definitely a favorite. So yes, and the page turner will post that up too. Yeah, but I mean, anything with the citrus and the bitter and the sweet elements are just lovely with gin. And you want, our London Dry is a really classic gin. That's definitely for martinis and things like that. With the Navy Strength, that's something that you're going to use in a really complex cocktail that may have other ingredients that could bury a more delicate gin in it. So yeah, just different uses for all that. So yeah, thank you to SIP for letting me do this. They are amazing. They do really awesome work, and we live in like one of the best parts of the world for craft spirits and beverages and wine. And I think someone earlier asked me what I'm drinking when I'm not drinking gin, and it's always, we love our wine. A lot of good Walla Walla stuff from Red Mountain. Shout out to Freshette's. I think I saw Shay on here earlier if they're still watching. They make awesome stuff. This time of year, I'm always enjoying a nice tequila or mezcal, and I'm a cigar guy too. I love a good Scotch, the Oban 14, the Balvenie Caribbean cask stuff. Always a favorite when I can afford them. I usually use my Christmas money to buy a bottle or two, and that'll last me a while. So yeah, thank you all. This has been fun. So go make yourself a drink, Negroni, G&T. I'm obviously going to have a great rest of my night right now. I have a couple to go around. So cheers, everybody. Thank you.